You're watching Behind the Headlines. I'm Pacchia. Last week, we saw one of the most renowned lawyers of her generation get nominated to chair the SEC. President Obama's appointment of Mary Jo White marks a bold move for an agency finding itself at a crucial juncture. Joining me now to discuss Ms. White and her appointment to run the SEC, we have Rick Firestone. He's a partner at McDermott Will Emery. Prior to entering private practice, of course, Rick was with the SEC for 12 years. He joins us from Washington, D.C., where it's 70 degrees at the end of January. Just unbelievable.
Fantastic. We should be doing the interview outside, Lee.
Right on. Rick, when you heard of this appointment, what went through your head?
A couple things. First, it's somewhat out of the box and unusual, but very commendable. And what I mean by outside the box is Mary Jo will be the first SEC chairman who has extensive experience, excuse me, as a federal prosecutor. That's very unique for an SEC chairman. And I think clearly the Obama administration is trying to send a message to the markets that the SEC is going to continue to be a tough cop. But with Mary Jo's background as a former federal prosecutor, she also has extensive experience in private practice. She's very familiar with the issues on Wall Street, the issues facing the capital markets. And from my perspective, really brings a very unique balance and perspective to the job.
Does it mean that we're going to see more prosecutions in your view?
Well, when the president announced Mary Jo's nomination last week in the White House, I think he says something along the lines of "Don't mess with Mary Jo," and I think we can give the president a little bit of an excuse for some hyperbole. But clearly, he's trying to send the message that the SEC is going to continue to be a tough cop. I think actually, Lee, the SEC has been on the beat, from my perspective, always. I know that the Commission and the Division of Enforcement received criticism in the wake of the Madoff situation. But clearly, with Mary Shapiro, the prior chairman, her appointment of Rob Kazami, another former federal prosecutor, as the head of the Division of Enforcement, even under the Shapiro tenure, the message was that the SEC was going to be a tough cop on Wall Street. And they've brought a lot of cases and a lot of big cases over the last couple of years. I think certainly the Mary Jo White nomination suggests that that will continue. Mary Jo obviously has a lot of experience in enforcement matters. She's quite sophisticated on enforcement issues, and I'm sure she's going to set an agenda at the SEC from an enforcement perspective where they will continue to remain very aggressive.
We were talking before about how your career paths were intertwined at one point. You've not quite worked with her, but against her in a couple matters. Without getting into specifics for the cases that you were working on, what does she like to work with?
Well, I did interact with Mary Jo on a number of occasions when I was an associate director at the SEC Division of Enforcement. Mary Jo is an extremely smart, sophisticated, talented lawyer. And I think you would expect that from someone who, in her previous career was the senior prosecutor and perhaps the most important federal prosecutor's office in the country in Manhattan. But she couples that with a lot of other very good qualities. Mary Jo is extremely level-headed. She has great judgment. She's very fair. She's very reasonable. And while I'm sure she will be a tough cop and she will set an agenda of tough enforcement, a good prosecutor, good law enforcement not only is tough, but it's fair and reasonable. And Mary Jo certainly has those qualities.
It's a really interesting career path. She spent years as a prosecutor, as you said, in a very busy jurisdiction, but she also spent years defending Wall Street and the big banks. At this point, is she more prosecutor or more defense attorney at this point in her career?
Well, again, I think the way to view this, Lee, is that I think she's going to be very fair and very balanced. She certainly understands, and she will understand as chairman of the SEC, that they have to be a tough cop on the street, and she will certainly set that tone and that agenda at the SEC. But I do think her time in private practice has obviously familiarized herself with a lot of the challenges, a lot of the issues that face Wall Street, financial services firms, and she has that understanding as well. At the end of the day, the SEC's mandate is to protect investors. Mary Jo certainly is aware of that. But with that said, given her background and experience, she knows that the issues oftentimes are very complex, and I think she'll bring a very unique perspective to her role as chairman.
One of the areas of focus of people that watch the SEC and what it does out there focuses on the area of remedies. Do you expect Mary Jo White's SEC to amend its approach to remedies? This whole thing with companies not necessarily admitting to wrongdoing as part of their settlements with the Commission, is that going to end? It's seemed to have irked a lot of people, including some judges.
Yeah, well, I think it is certainly a topic that has the attention of some judges around the country. I'm sure Mary Jo and I know the SEC staff in total is aware of this issue. And that's a complicated issue with regards to a couple of things on remedies. One, the issue of requiring defendants to admit liability. I think that's actually a very, very difficult issue because it may very well preclude the SEC from being able to settle cases where defendants are not willing to make that admission. I think, Lee, it's important to remember the perception of the SEC is that I think it is a larger agency and organization than it actually is. It is a relatively small federal agency. It has limited resources. And if the SEC and Mary Jo adopt a new policy requiring in all instances an admission of liability, I think she's aware of the impact that that will have on the ability to settle cases. With regards to financial sanctions and remedies, obviously there is some momentum on the Hill to increase the financial penalties and sanctions that the SEC can get in enforcement cases. And I think that is perhaps more likely than a sea change in policy, which would require in all instances an admission of liability. There are some instances where the SEC does require certain defendants to admit liability, but in many instances to settle a case they don't. But I think it's also important to remember that's not unique to the SEC as a federal agency. There are many federal agencies other than the SEC that also enter into settlements without requiring a defendant to admit liability.
Now, Rick, she also happens to be married to another very successful attorney, Mr. John White at Cravath. Between the two of them, I would imagine that Ms. White would have a lot of conflicts as chair of the SEC. Is this going to be a problem going forward?
Well, I certainly think it could raise some challenges, but I don't think it's going to be, at the end of the day, a significant problem. First and foremost, Mary Jo and her husband John White, extremely smart and ethical lawyers. And I think that Mary Jo, obviously, since this issue has been raised in the last couple of days, is going to be sensitive to conflicts issues and ethics issues. But Mary Jo has excellent judgment. And furthermore, the SEC, through its ethics office, Mary Jo is going to get top-notch ethics advice. And I'm sure will weigh all the ethics issues very closely. But at the end of the day, while it may raise certain challenges in certain instances, I don't see this as a problem that can't be managed, and I think she'll manage it fine.
Rick, do me a favor, just in closing here. Put yourself in Mary Jo's shoes for a minute. What needs to happen day one on the job? What's the first thing that she needs to do?
Well, I think one of the things that also Mary Jo brings to the table is, since she was the head of the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, Mary Jo's been a leader. She's led an office with very talented and sophisticated lawyers. She's coming to an agency which has taken some bruises over the past couple of years, but I think the public perception is that the agency is coming back. I think Mary Jo needs to go into the commission, set her agenda. She's a leader. I think she'll get the SEC staff motivated. They've got a lot of work on their plate with regards to rulemaking and regulatory issues. They have a full agenda on enforcement issues as well. And I think she'll set the tone of being a very aggressive SEC chairman, but one who can lead an agency facing the challenges that it does.
All right. Rick Firestone joining us from a balmy Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time today, sir.
Thanks, Lee. Have a good day.
You too. If you'd like to learn more about the cases and issues we just discussed, be sure to go check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. You can follow our updates on Twitter and see more of our videos on YouTube. I'm Lee Pacchia. Thanks for watching.